Unapologetic Leadership, right here on the Leadership Voice. Welcome to the Leadership Voice. I'm your host, Jay Barbuto. Today we continue our GRIT series and talk about overcoming the challenges of diversity and inclusion. Joining us today is Scharrell Jackson, CEO and founder of Leadership in Heels and COO for Lendistry. Lendistry is a minority-led, mission-based lender and technology company that provides a unique way to deploy capital to underserved markets, businesses, and people. Scharrell brings 35 years of executive-level finance and operation experiences in a variety of industries and companies. She is one of the most engaging and purposeful executives I know and a true ambassador and advocate for diversity and inclusion in corporate America. Please welcome friend and colleague, one of my favorites, Scharrell Jackson.
Hi, Jay. Thank you so much for having me this morning.
Scharrell, it's so great to have you on the show today so we can talk a little bit about diversity, inclusion, and the struggles and lessons that others might be able to learn from your experiences. Could you maybe start by talking a little bit about your personal story of grit and how you've had to overcome?
Oh, wow. I don't know if we have enough time, but there are a number of examples of my stories of grit. There are examples of being discriminated against. There are examples of not necessarily being included, not always because of discrimination, but I think when we think about the lack of inclusion, we try to make it about race. But if anybody thinks about a time where you were disregarded, not included, left out or left behind, and how you handle that and move through those things, those help you to develop grit. There have been specific examples that I could give you around raising my children and things not necessarily going the way that I wanted them to. And therefore, I had to develop a lot of grit and learn how to be a better parent as a leader in the community and in the workplace, navigating through leading a variety of individuals with different personalities, backgrounds, and experience, and learning how to be a better leader, which I wasn't always. That helps you to develop grit. So there are so many things that I've gone through in my life that have helped me to develop grit. But what I would say specifically is it is a result of learning from my opportunities for improvement. It's a result of making mistakes. It's a result of not wearing my emotions on my sleeve, and more importantly, not giving up, but becoming stronger and better each and every time that I approach a new situation. And as a result of those things, it gives you grit.
And so not everybody approaches everything like perfectly the first time, and not everybody has the right, either the right mindset or the right approach. Could you share a little bit about some of your opportunities that you've had? We talk about the opportunities, mistakes that we've made where, oh, I didn't handle that the way I should have. And now I understand much better how those situations could have been handled. Could you share a couple of those teachable moments?
Oh, absolutely. I think, you could go back to when you're early in your career and you manage your leadership life different at different stages of your life. So the first thing I would say is we've all got to give ourselves grace. But, I've been blessed to be in leadership since leaving college. And when I was early in my career, I was far more emotionally charged than I am now as a very emotionally mature leader and adult and woman and mom. And as a result of that, I really navigated around how I feel. And oftentimes when we are leading in a manner that we're not necessarily proud of, it's a result of fear. So I can think about times where I might have thought that I wasn't going to miss the mark, or maybe I didn't meet the expectation of my employer. And as a result of that, I became fearful. And that impacts the way that we communicate. Our style, especially, is an area where I really had to grow and not necessarily respond according to my emotions. Somebody says something that you don't like, you take offense, you become hypersensitive, and then you bark back, as opposed to really digesting the information that's being said to you, listening for what the resolution is, and then responding in a manner that gets you to the end game. I've had a myriad of situations where I have been in situations as a Black woman where people were not pleased that I was the person at the table and that were rude and disrespectful to me. And as a result of that, I might have been rude and disrespectful back. And those are lessons learned, right? Because you get nowhere by being anything other than the unapologetic great leader that you strive to be. And so I can think of one specific example of where I didn't meet my boss's expectation, or so he thought. And as a result of what he thought, he responded to me in a way that I think was less than thoughtful. And it hurt my feelings. And in that particular situation, as a leader, people tend to forget that you actually do have feelings, but I do. And it hurt my feelings. And as a result of that, there was a time where I responded expressing how I felt. And I didn't do it in the most professional way. And then there was also a time where I failed to express and I withdrew and I became quiet. And both of those are perfect examples of mistakes that I've made. Well, really what I needed to do was feel what I feel, focus on what the end game was, and approach it in a much more professional, mature way. So I've done both. I've barked and been a bull in a china shop, and I've withdrawn and become quiet and non-communicative. And on both sides, they're not the right way to approach any situation.
So in a way, there's almost like there's this balance of these two tensions. There's the tension of wanting to make sure you're sticking up for yourself and that you're advocating for yourself, while also that other tension of having some level of diplomacy, some level of cordiality, some level of professionalism. It sounds like you've spent a lot of time towing the line of those two tensions.
Yeah, and I would say that it's while staying true to your authentic self. I think the end game around really developing grit is that you learn and you grow from your mistakes, but you don't deviate from who you are. You perfect to become the best leader that you can be. And in many, many instances where I've been challenged, especially around diversity and inclusion, where I'm not necessarily invited to the party, for lack of a better word. Everybody goes to lunch, but I don't get an invitation. Or when we're at a conference, a C-suite conference, and most of the men and the people in the room look like you, to be honest with you, Jay. And everybody goes off to dinner and I don't get invited. I've learned that there's no point in really bringing some sort of a challenging conversations to individuals when oftentimes people are not even conscious of what they're doing and or may not even care. So what I've learned is that I have to really digest some things and be able to speak about the things that matter, that can help move the needle forward, and things that do not matter is not really worth the conversation. But more importantly, when I'm having a conversation, again, I really have to think about what is it that I want to resolve? What is the point that I want to get across? And what's the best way to do that? And nobody wants to do that in a contentious way where they feel like there's a lot of stress or anxiety around the conversation. So sometimes I have to take pause, Jay, and wait and talk about it later. So it just depends on the situation.
And so really that process of navigating, staying true to yourself, but also staying true to yourself, but also not ignoring things that really shouldn't get ignored in companies. Have you ever found yourself in situations where you've had to be a little extra assertive and really, I would say, make changes for
It's interesting. That's a perfect word because, I spoke about 52 times on diversity and inclusion and belonging over the past year, especially with the pandemic and the blatant awareness around what's going on with Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, because people had no choice but to see what was right in front of them. And obviously, as an African-American woman who's raised 3 Black sons as a single mom, it's been a lifestyle for us. And having had conversations with individuals over the past year, primarily individuals who really wanted to do something different, but wasn't really sure how, caused for me to really be assertive in certain conversations, because many people don't want to hear the word about being a racist, but the conversation becomes, but are you an anti-racist? It's not always about what you're necessarily doing wrong, but what is it that you're doing right to move the needle forward? And those can be viewed as pretty contentious conversations. I also can recall a specific example where when I'm in an environment where my communication style is different, because let's face it, as an African-American, we are actually taught to be direct and actually say what you mean and mean what you say. In fact, I didn't even know what it meant to be politically correct until I came into Orange County. And I think I shared this with you. And somebody said that you needed to be politically correct. And I thought to myself, well, does that mean you don't tell the truth? And so I've had to really tote the line around who I am versus what is expected of me. And it's okay for me to be who it is that I am. And I've had individuals try and coach me into my having a communication style that's more aligned with the majority. But the conversation that I've had back is, how do you have inclusion when you want everyone to behave the same and yet say that we want diversity? Because diversity is more than just how it looks on the screen or their employee roster, but it's a diversity of thought, it's diversity of communication style, it is our approach, it's everything about us that makes us different, not just the way we look. So I've had some pretty strong conversations around that, where I've had to stand up for myself in a very diplomatic and professional way, and yet ascertain the adamants about where I fit and how I feel about a situation. And I want to say one other thing to you, Jay. The comment around being assertive or aggressive, I find it really challenging because we teach our boys to stand up for what they want. We teach them to be assertive. We want them to be aggressive. We would never, ever categorize that as a negative when we talk about a guy. But oftentimes when we talk about girls, people will even be remiss. I remember someone saying, oh, well, she's very aggressive, assertive. Oh, no, I don't want to say that. And I thought to myself, well, why wouldn't we want to say that about a leader? We want our leaders to be assertive. And yet we actually shame it when it's a female. So it's a very interesting dichotomy.
Yeah. And then and so someone such as yourself, you have kind of the combination. You have the differences in the attributions that are based on person's gender, but then you also have the differences in from race, and so
Right.
you're navigating kind of two sets of expectations that others may have, and then trying to navigate that while still advocating for yourself, advocating for your best interests, and sometimes getting angry and being angry and wanting to tell them and put them in their place. I mean, how do
Stand up for myself, right?
how do you keep yourself from just exploding on people when they're acting like so inappropriately?
I don't. I guess the bottom line is this. Look, I've been in a male-dominated environment my entire career. And so many times in my environment, there's an expectation of me as a woman. And sometimes there is unconscious bias that people just don't expect. I can be in a conversation, 9 men, I'm the only woman. They interrupt each other when they're talking. It's the natural style. If I interject something, everybody's going to look at me as if I'm being rude. There are specific expectations depending on a man and a woman that we don't even realize we place on one another. And when it comes to leadership, we all should be based on the fact that we are individual contributors and leader, not necessarily the expectation of the mom or the woman or the female, because we're naturally nurturers, right? And so there's an expectation. And oftentimes I've had to stand up for myself. And when I've made a comment and someone overtalks me, then I have to be able to say, I would appreciate it if you would not interrupt me when I'm speaking. Or if I have something to say and someone feels like they want to try and correct how I said it or what I said, then I ask them, I would appreciate it if you would share with me why you just did what you did. And it can make people very uncomfortable because most people don't stand up and advocate for themselves. And I do. I advocate not only for others, but I advocate for myself. And to the extent that the treatment that I'm receiving is not aligned with my expectation, I am unafraid to share that in the most loving and caring way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who's the recipient feels that way about what they've been told.
I love how you describe advocating for yourself, but also advocating for others. Could you talk? I know that this is something that lots of folks have talked about before, but I thought it would be important to have as part of this episode. Could you talk a little bit about the notion of being non-racist versus being anti-racist, and what that really, how that's actually a different level of inclusion?
Absolutely, I can. In my former place of employment, we were really struggling with with diversity and inclusion, because we felt like we were a very diverse environment. But, I was the only Black executive in the organization. And I was having a lot of challenges with style, with communication. I was constantly being coached that I needed to speak like everybody else in the room. But when I came to the table, I wasn't like everybody else in the room. So the expectation of me to speak like everyone else was to ask me to dilute who I was as a person in order to make everybody else in the room feel comfortable. And so right there, you take inclusion and you throw it out the window. I think that when we are talking about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, we need to be really, really careful about why we're actually saying that that's something that we want to do, other than it's the sexy thing to do, or it's the new initiative, right, on the table. When I think about some of the challenges that I have had with navigating through diversity, inclusion, and belonging, what I think about most importantly is what I'm not going to do. And one of the conversations that I've had is that I am not going to be unafraid to tell the truth. So many people going to racism and anti-racism, so many people that I spoke with over the last years talked about the fact that, well, I just need to understand. I really don't understand what it's like to be Black. I really don't understand. So they lean in on what they're hearing or what they're led to feel. But what I say to people is, do you like animals? And if you do, and you saw a dog being mutilated in the street, would you need to know what it feels like to be a dog in order to have compassion and empathy? And most people in that very moment recognize that it's a no. So it's not so much that you need to understand versus that you need to care. And I think that when you talk about racism versus anti-racism, racist individuals project harm on others. Anti-racism stand up for others. And so it's not just that you're not projecting harm, but when you're among a lot of people and you hear them making racist jokes or comments, do you sit there in silence? Or do they know that that's not appropriate to have that conversation in front of you? And so that's one of the small differences when you think about somebody being an anti-racist. And when you really start to check your circle and check the conversations that you've allowed yourself to be around, it is whether or not you're really standing up and being unafraid to stand for something, even if you have to stand alone in a crowd. And many people are not willing to do that.
Oh, thank you, Scharrell. And I think that's a great way of really coming to understand that distinction between being a non-racist and being an anti-racist. And it comes down to doing no harm yourself versus allowing others to bear witness to harm and to advocate for those whenever we see it, and to be tuned in for moments when those things might be happening around us.
We all have an ability to be difference makers. And I think that if people are comfortable having conversations that are less than favorable or less than moving the needle forward for others in your presence, then you've got to check who you are as an individual. And for me, for no one is going to be that comfortable. I mean, they're not going to sit in the room and have a negative conversation about Jay in my presence, because I'm going to let them know that that's just not appropriate and you can't talk about Jay in my presence. But if somebody feels like they can, and my position is just that, well, I didn't participate in the conversation, I think this is where we tend to compromise where right and wrong lie. And so I think that until we're all able to advocate for what's right and be willing to sacrifice relationships and or to change the minds of others because they admire and respect us, then we're not going to move the needle forward. And it's not just about Black people. It's all people. It's all situations. It's really just standing up for what is right. And I think that to be anti anything is to make sure that we're willing to stand for something versus stand in a crowd and stand for nothing.
And so really, it's not just about race. It's about all injustices and all the way we treat people and the kind of society and community we want to live in.
Right. And I think that, we have this, one of the things that help us develop grit is when you have been through something, you have no choice but to become stronger. Jay, I was recently driving down the street. I have a car that's very expensive. I was driving the street. It was late at night. I had left out of the house in my son's hoodie. My hair is short and I had a hood on my head. And in that moment in time, I knew what it was like to actually be racially profiled. I pulled out of a driveway. I saw the police officer looking at me, nose to nose, eye to eye. I knew in that moment I was going to be pulled over by the police. Why would I even feel that? Now I'm pulling out. I happen to have a Louis Vuitton bag sitting in the passenger seat. So when he pulls me, I pull out, I turn. He follows behind me, Jay. I go all the way down, make a U-turn, knowing that I'm going to be pulled over. Puts the siren on, I pull over. He assumed I was a boy, a Black boy driving in a $100,000 plus car. And what was I doing? Came up to my window, gun pulled, and tapped on my window. When I let the window down and he saw the purse in the seat, immediately he knew that I was a female. I pulled the hood off. And the first thing I said is, why is your gun drawn? And so I think the thing is, as we hear these stories and we see this, we spin things around in a way to make it look as if it's not actually happening. But I'm a highly successful individual. You've known me for years. I ended up being told to have a nice day. But the bottom line is, I walked away with the fear of, what if that was one of my sons, right? What if that was one of my sons? So when I share that story, do we have compassion? Do we have empathy? Are we willing to do something different as a community of people to change the narrative around that, to change the experience of people? And I think that's for all people, whether it's handicapped, whether it's gays, whether it's Black people, whomever it is. And I think that takes us back to that whole thing around being an anti-racist and really standing up for the injustices for everybody.
That's terrific. Scharrell, we do have some questions from our audience. Would it be okay if we went to those?
Absolutely.
Terrific. So our first question actually comes from Jeanette Miller. And Jeanette Miller, let me see her question. She asks, how would you like to see things change for women of color in your industry?
I think what I would love to see is that more women of color have an opportunity to rise to the top. There's a huge disparity between women of color at the C-suite compared to just women in general, and then of people of color as well. I would love to see that change. And in my industry, my former industry, I just entreed into a fintech, and I'm in a minority-led business. But as you know, Jay, I was in the CPA industry for over 20 years. And for all of that time, from the point in which I entreed into the C-suite, I was the only female Black in the C-suite in the top 100 firms in the nation. So I would love to see there be more opportunity for women of color. And I think that in order for that to happen, business leaders have to go to where we are. But I would love to see us able to have more opportunity across all industries to be able to rise to the top as quickly as white men can.
Oh, I love that. And now you left that industry. So now that industry has zero?
There's zero.
Wow. So that
zero. And there's less than 1% African Americans in the accounting industry.
Okay. Wow. So our second question, I'll save the commentary, but our second question is from Steve Terrence from Fullerton, California. And Steve asks, who would you consider to be your inspiration?
Gosh, I have so many inspirations in my life, personally, professionally, spiritually. But I think if I had to just pick one in this particular moment, and to be clear, they change depending on, as I matriculate in life. I would actually have to say it's Joyce Myers. Joyce Myers is an author. She's a minister. She's a pastor. And she is, to me, a human being who's gone through just the normal day-to-day cycles of life, having been grown up the way that she did, not always growing up in the ministry, being abused, going through and being on different sides of the track, and having to evolve as a human being. And the stories that she tells and the way that she really migrated from abuse and the way she's led her life into being a woman of grit and resilience, and then making a difference in the lives of others, and the authenticity in the way that she tells the story to support others. I truly admire that.
Oh, those are wonderful things to admire. And when I was looking at the questions, I saw that was one of the questions from our audience. I actually was really excited to hear your answer to that. And you didn't disappoint. So thank you for answering that. So our third question is a little bit light, a lighter question. How do you spend your spare time? This is from Emmanuel Tang from Anaheim Hills. So Scharrell, how do you spend your spare time?
I guess we go pre or post COVID. I think when you think about the things that I love music, I love to travel, and I love my family and friends. And so I spend my time really, if I have the opportunity, entertaining and spending time with my family. That's probably the number one thing that I love to do. I would spend time with my family as often as I could if they would want to be bothered by me. So I love that. And then concerts, live music, and traveling. Those are the things that I love to do.
Those are all great things, actually. So that's terrific. Well, Scharrell, I want to thank you for joining us on today's episode. It's so wonderful to have the opportunity to talk with you. I know you and I do have these chats all the time, not on air, but it's just great to have you on the show. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate the opportunity.
Terrific. And please, our audience, please remember to like and share and subscribe to our videos. We are changing lives, and you are a big part of that changing of other people's lives by sharing these great messages and these great videos. Please consider joining us for each episode of the Leadership Voice as we bring you many relevant topics that can guide your leadership development. On behalf of the Center for Leadership here at Cal State Fullerton, I'm Jay Barbuto, and we'll see you next time right here on the Leadership Voice.